A first dog now is reported with coronavirus. Cats were first, house cats, but also a big one in the Bronx. I talked to PETA's own coronavirus expert on how to protect your companion animals during the pandemic and how the best way to speed up the fight against the virus is to stop testing on animals. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this behind-the-scenes look at PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. And we're heading into May, and the pandemic is not over, but some states in the U.S. are reopening for business just the same as people tire of the tough medicine that is social distancing, the only effective way to fight the virus without adequate testing or a vaccine. But consider the numbers. More than 1 million cases in the U.S., with the death toll to the virus, as I speak, at nearly 60,000. That's more than the number of deaths in the Vietnam War. The pandemic affects every family member in one's household, from our cats, and now our first dog reportedly has the virus. Dr. Samantha Saunders is a former veterinarian turned medical researcher for PETA UK. She's PETA's in-house coronavirus expert. I asked her about the virus and our companion animals and whether to be concerned. We also talk about the characteristics of coronaviruses and how to fight them effectively. And we talk about the race for the vaccine, how the best way to speed up the process is to end all animal testing. Dr. Saunders was in the UK when I caught up with her. Here's our conversation on the PETA Podcast. Dr. Saunders, you're a scientist with PETA UK and a veterinarian, but you're also a coronavirus researcher. How did that happen? Veterinarian, coronavirus researcher. Tell us about your background.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I trained as a vet. I worked in an animal shelter for a little while, and then I really felt I wanted to do something to help animals on as large a scale as I possibly could. So I did a PhD in feline coronavirus, which is a very common viral disease of cats. It's a little bit like the human coronavirus that obviously we're also aware of now, but actually this one only really affects cats. I studied that for around 4 years, and then I moved to PETA, where I'm now a research associate and using my veterinary and science skills to help animals.
And so tell me about the cat coronavirus, because the coronavirus has, there have been some big cats in the Bronx Zoo who've had it. There's been some reports about cats who have coronavirus. And I guess it's we're lucky that you're both a vet and a cat coronavirus researcher. Tell us about how or if cats can be contagious to humans, or where do they fit in the equation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So the virus that I studied was feline coronavirus, which only affects cats. And obviously now we have SARS coronavirus 2, which is causing the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's a different virus, although it's closely related to feline coronavirus. And as you say, we have seen the odd report of SARS-CoV-2 infecting cats. I think it's something that we don't really know all that much about yet as a scientific community. We don't quite know the extent of how cats can become infected and, whether this is even really a problem in cats. I would say because so many humans at this point have been infected with COVID-19, and actually we're not seeing that many reports of cats who have become sick with the virus, it's probably not too much of an issue in a kind of home setting. And I would say that anyone who's living with a cat or another companion animal and is at all concerned, there's absolutely no need to be. So we have no evidence that cats or other companion animals pose any risk to you or your family. And all you need to do is just follow sensible hygiene precautions, as you always would, like washing your hands after touching your animal companion.
So the cat wouldn't have the virus on its fur. You wouldn't have to worry about that, or its paws, or that it could somehow
if it climbed all over your lap and on your shoulders, you needn't worry about a cat giving you anything.
Like any surface, a cat's fur or a dog's fur could potentially become contaminated with coronavirus. That is certainly a possibility. But I would say that when you're talking about animals who live in your household, the only place they would have got that virus from would be from a human in the household. And that human would already be infected. So they don't pose any additional risk to you or your family. And again, the best thing you can do is really just wash your hands after handling animals.
Right. Wash your hands, and also if it's an indoor cat, keep your cat indoors, right? No, don't let it go outside.
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Keep your cat indoors, keep your cat to your household. Same with dogs, actually. So if you take your dog out to the dog park, here in the UK, we don't tend to have dog parks, but we just have regular parks where dogs run around and meet each other. It's best to keep them close to you. So I know a lot of local councils are recommending keeping your dog on a lead so that they don't then run over to another dog and mix with them, or run over to other humans and kind of rub their coat on those humans. And that's just another way of kind of keeping each household separate to try to stop the spread of the coronavirus.
It's been said that, when people explain the Bronx Zoo and the big cats there, how they got coronavirus, it's been said that humans are a danger to the animals, or the companion animals, or big cats at the zoo, but it doesn't go the other way. It doesn't go from the companion animals to humans. Is that another fair statement or correct statement?
I would say at this point, we don't have any evidence to suggest that that's the case. And it's quite an unusual situation, because when we think about pandemics, 75% of emerging infectious diseases come into the human population from animals. That's a really, really common way that disease outbreaks happen in humans. And usually we think about animals potentially harboring diseases that could be harmful to us. But in this case, we're looking at a situation where actually we're harboring diseases that we could then be transmitting to our companion animals and to animals in zoos. And, in the case of monkeys, perhaps animals in research laboratories as well.
Yeah, but that's interesting, though. If it's known that in pandemics that the virus can go from animals and jump species to humans, why are we concerned so much that it could go from cats to humans? Is it because we just don't have the research?
I would say to an extent, yep, it seems that the research just isn't there. So we don't know how susceptible cats are to the virus. We don't really know how widespread the virus is in them. And when you look at the way that the virus has spread, it just seems much more likely that we'd be looking at something like, the vast majority being human to human spread. And then in some cases, we're almost getting a spillover into companion animals. It doesn't seem logical that cats or other companion animals would be playing a major role, because they're not the guys who are going out, mixing with other households, going to the grocery store, touching things, sharing airspace with each other. So it logically just makes a lot more sense that humans would be the ones spreading the virus amongst themselves. And then in some rare cases, you might get almost a spillover event of that virus into a cat in your household. The best thing that we can do is really just to, act as we always have with our companion animals. There's nothing to suggest that there's any danger to us.
Right.
We just need to be sensible, really.
Okay. All right. So I'm glad that we got the vet and the cat stuff and the coronavirus, but that still leaves the big issue of the coronavirus, which everyone is concerned about. Tell me, as a researcher, and you're seeing the news, and people or states in the here in America are starting to open up. Some states, some businesses. Does that concern you as a researcher, knowing what you know? Because even though you studied feline coronavirus, you probably have done so much more research than the average person, than a lay person like myself. Would the signs of states reopening right now or within the next few days, does that concern or alarm you?
I think that's something that societies need to decide amongst themselves,
Mm-hmm.
because we kind of know a fair bit now about the behavior of the virus. And we know a lot of the clinical signs it causes in people. We have a rough idea of how many people get sick with it and, what kind of populations are most at risk from it. But really the issue here is, as a society, what level of risk are we willing to take? And are we willing to sacrifice people essentially in order to reopen states? And I feel I would be slightly out of my depth commenting on that. So my background is in lab research. I was actually when I was working on feline coronavirus, I was working on identifying which receptor the virus uses to enter cells.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my background is much more in the molecular behavior of the virus, the way that it works on a cellular level. And I'm afraid when it comes to things like policy, I would really know as much as the layperson. Of course, I have my own opinions and theories, but that's just from following the news.
Well,
that's not really from a scientific point of view.
Well, Dr. Saunders, I respect your deference there. However, as a scientist and knowing what you know about the virus, if people go back to work or go back, into society and come out of shelter, what kind of risk does that pose? I mean, it would seem to me, the layperson, to be logical that if things are getting better because we are secluding or quarantining ourselves, suddenly if we were now to go back into society, now we're putting ourselves at risk. How does a virus react to more people out there if the virus is still out there?
Well, the virus, I mean, if we can anthropomorphize for a second, the virus wants to spread. That's what it's evolved to do. It loves to infect new hosts. So what the virus wants more than anything is for us, or say for infected people, to get out there and to meet as many new people as they possibly can and get that virus into as many new people as they possibly can. And that's how the virus succeeds. So by allowing, removing lockdown conditions and allowing people out of their homes and to mingle again, then we're really giving the virus an opportunity to just spread like wildfire through the population. And we already know that although this virus isn't as dangerous as previous coronaviruses like SARS and MERS, it is still pretty dangerous. And we're seeing a significant proportion of the population going into hospital, going to intensive care, having to be on respirators. So it's certainly no trivial thing. And really, we need to be sure that when lockdown orders start to subside and people start getting out there again, we need to be certain that there's capacity at hospitals to manage this sort of thing.
Yeah. And how about because everyone is aware of the idea of flattening the curve. They don't want to have more cases than the hospital's capacity because, and it seems like being under quarantine or sheltering in place has helped because there's a certain amount of confidence, although there's some conflicts in the information. Some states which are not seeing a decline are opening up, and I think it's just a matter of people saying, okay, well, we got to fix the economy, or people are going stir crazy. And when you hear things like that, as a researcher who knows about coronavirus and how it spreads, that must irritate you somewhat, huh?
I think, again, it's one of these issues that as a wider society, people really need to consider. I would not dismiss the issue of people's mental health. I think that some people are really, really struggling in lockdown. And that's not a trivial thing either. And that is a really important consideration when we're thinking about this sort of thing. People need to be able to look after their mental health, as well as avoid becoming infected with the virus. But yeah, I guess in some cases it seems premature to be lifting these kind of restrictions. When we're not actually seeing any flattening of the curve, then if you lift the restrictions and you see yet another peak, how on earth are you going to expect hospitals to cope with that extra burden?
Now, as we speak, I mentioned these states opening up here in the U.S. But then there's the approach in Sweden where they're using this herding idea. Uh, what is your thought, knowing what you know about how the virus spreads? Is that an effective way? Sweden seems to have the same number of deaths. It seems to be working somewhat. People are out there not sheltering in place. Can you explain how that works in Sweden and how people in the United States maybe should or shouldn't be uh, uh, jealous of how they're doing it there, or how do you view it as someone who studied the coronavirus?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting approach. It's actually what the UK was originally going for. So there was loads of talk here about herd immunity and not really having particularly strict lockdown measures, more a kind of social distancing approach. So perhaps no large gatherings, but people can still go out and go about their normal lives otherwise. Um, I don't know too many specifics about Sweden, but I believe they still have some measures in place.
Yes.
But of course, those measures are a lot more lenient than we're seeing in the US and the UK. I think it's interesting. My reservations would be that coronaviruses, being infected with a coronavirus doesn't always provide lasting immunity. That's something to note about coronaviruses, and that's really typical of them. So going for a herd immunity approach, which is essentially where you're hoping enough of the population becomes infected, that enough people have immunity to the virus, that it just kind of stops the spread in its tracks. It's a risky approach when we don't currently know whether being infected with the virus actually provides lasting immunity. And the other issue is that by kind of going for these approaches, you are essentially saying that the people who are becoming sick, are going to hospital, are dying, they're being sacrificed for this approach to be able to work. It's a really, really interesting issue. And of course, it brings up the question of the vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
So everyone's talking about a coronavirus vaccine being the holy grail and the thing that's going to get us out of lockdown and out of social distancing. But my experience of feline coronavirus vaccines is that they can be a very, very tricky thing and actually plagued with problems. And oh my goodness, I would love it if we developed a vaccine. It would be wonderful. But I have my reservations about it. That's what I would say.
There's one company in particular, Gilead, which is developing a vaccine, and some people are very excited to see the results. It's in trial now. However, there are some conflicting stories coming out about how effective this is. So what you're suggesting really is that we can have a lot of false positives on all fronts, the vaccine front, the immunity herding front. I mean, we just don't know enough about the virus, whether or not we build up antibodies or not build up antibodies so that we have immunity. And so we're really playing it by ear in a way, right?
I think absolutely. Coronaviruses in general are very tricky viruses. They mutate quite readily. They jump species. They have a very poor history of being able to be vaccinated against. There aren't really any successful treatments for them. So, yeah, I think we're in a position of great uncertainty. And just knowing what I know about feline coronavirus and the history of feline coronavirus treatments and vaccines. So we have this issue of, so this is actually something that's really relevant to what's happening now with the vaccine trials. We have, as you mentioned, there's a vaccine in the US, which is just beginning clinical trials in humans. We also have one in the UK, which is, I believe, at a similar place to the US one. So just going into humans for the first time.
Mm-hmm.
These are really exciting candidates. What I absolutely love about them is that essentially medicines regulators around the world, so this is like the US FDA, the EMA, and the European Medicines Agency, that is, are taking the decision that in the face of the coronavirus crisis, some animal tests that would usually be required can actually be bypassed. I think this is really exciting and really interesting because the message that I'm getting from that is that when we need a vaccine and we need it fast, some of these animal tests are disposable. They're not a priority. So if we're finding now that actually some animal tests are getting in the way of vaccine development, then why not take that forward? Why not take that policy change and apply it to all vaccines and all medicines that are developed in the future and say, actually, if these animal tests aren't serving us and they're impeding progress, then why not just get rid of them?
Right. That is the one silver lining, that we may not be on the road to saving human lives quickly, but if we can dispense of the animal tests, we do save animal lives, and we can maybe open up the floodgates for say maybe broader vaccine research, and in doing so, as I said, save millions, really, of animals' lives throughout the world.
Yeah, those decisions that have been taken with those two vaccines, they may already be saving animal lives. And by putting this vaccine into humans in a safe and responsible way, I should add, this isn't, they're not just going ahead and doing something that they have no idea about. This is something that's been carefully planned and carefully conducted so that it is safe in humans. We're going to get results that are actually applicable to humans as quickly as we possibly can. If we had to wait months to see whether this vaccine, raised an immune response in monkeys or in mice, then essentially that wouldn't tell us anything about what happens in humans, because there are examples time and time again of a vaccine looking successful in so-called animal models and then going on to actually provide no protection to humans. So I'm just so happy that these vaccines are going into humans and are being tested in a relevant way.
All right, now I will play devil's advocate here, because to me, from what you've said throughout our conversation here, is that we really don't know. And if I'm a scientist and I'm looking for the answer and we really don't know, wouldn't that then justify the approach of using animals if I felt that was a way that we could get to an answer or the answer? How would you respond to that hypothetical scientist that I portrayed there in the last 5 seconds? What would you tell him?
I think the really telling thing is that if this is a way for us to find the answers, and I would say that this is not a way for us to find the answers. So let's just, not think about COVID-19 for a second. The history of testing in animals is a history that's just littered with examples of animal tests failing to predict human responses. So we have this really shocking stat, which comes from the US National Institutes of Health, that 95% of drugs that test positive in animal tests, they pass animal tests, go on to fail in human studies. And this is usually because they're not safe or they're not effective. And then we have diseases like stroke or Alzheimer's, where researchers have been conducting experiments in animals for decades, and they fail to come up with a single therapy that benefits humans. So when we look at facts like that, it just makes me think we have limited resources. We're working against the clock. We really, really need something that will actually come up with the goods and benefit humans. So what we need to be doing is funding and supporting humane, modern, non-animal methods.
What should scientists be paying attention to? What are these humane, non-animal methods?
There are quite a few exciting projects going on at the moment. One that I think is really cool, maybe just because it's a computer with a name. So there's this supercomputer called Summit, which lives in Tennessee. And this computer is apparently the smartest supercomputer in the world. And what researchers are doing are they're taking the structure of part of the coronavirus and the structure of various drugs and comparing them. So they're using advanced computer simulations to compare these structures and figure out which existing drugs might be effective in treating COVID-19. And then once they have some positive hits, they can go on and test the drugs in cells that are infected with the virus. And this will quickly screen the drugs to see which might be actually really effective at treating COVID-19. And I think this is a great approach because we're using known drugs, existing drugs. So we already know that they're safe to use in humans, but we're repurposing them for the purpose of treating COVID-19.
And so why don't researchers in general, if they know that these technologies exist, why do they insist on these traditional methods that rely on animal tests, especially considering that animal tests have not produced the answers that these vaccine researchers have sought?
So I'm going to give you a bit of a cynical answer, which is that doing things the same old way as they've always been done is what brings in the grant money, and it's what gets people published. So, these researchers aren't necessarily going to work every day thinking they're going to save the world. They're doing this because that might be what their supervisor did, and that might be what their supervisor did. It's habit. It's the way that they've been doing things for years, and they don't want to put themselves out of business. A fossil fuel company wouldn't willingly stop drilling for oil. And I don't think animal experimenters are going to make themselves redundant either by admitting that their experiments don't work.
So what you're saying, Dr. Saunders, this is not a cynical answer. It's just the truth. There is bad scientific researcher DNA in our medical research institutes, right? I mean, it just replicates itself to its bad and non-productive end. And so what's going to break it? More technological breakthroughs, or once someone really comes up with an answer that is so stunning that all the scientists have to doff off their white coats and say, well, let's go and put on another white coat and do it this new way?
Yeah, I think it will be a change in attitudes, really. So I think that actually, this COVID-19 crisis does present an opportunity. So you might have heard about lots of labs, particularly in the US, having to shut down some of their ongoing experiments. And this is because COVID-19 and lockdown orders are preventing people from going to work as usual. And a lot of research institutes have deemed certain experiments non-essential, and that means that they're not continuing those experiments, and often they're killing the animals who were involved in those experiments. And so what we're saying is that when these people go back to work, take this as an opportunity to think about what you're doing. This is a turning point. I mean, people don't have to just carry on doing what they've always been doing. They've been given an opportunity to rethink, to reimagine what science could look like, and to go back to work using these amazing non-animal methods.
And it seems to me that it's kind of a generational thing too, that the generation or generations that have set the tone for medical research are somewhat dying out, and maybe a new generation is taking over along with the technology that's riding in on this new wave of scientific research.
Yeah, I think there's some truth in that. Yeah, so we're seeing kind of younger researchers spearheading quite a lot of this really advanced non-animal science. And I hope that really by making it public how amazing these methods are, and talking to people about how actually really we don't need tests on animals, it's a false choice. So oftentimes people will say, we need these things for medical progress, we need these things to treat diseases. But I would just say, look at the track record of animal tests. Look at how we still have, so few treatments for these things that have been using animal tests for decades. And actually think about what we're doing here. So as a society, an awful lot of research is funded by taxpayer money. So we really do have a say in how that's spent. And I, for one, don't consent to wasting that money on animal experiments. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners here won't either.
So tell me more about the animal test and why you are so against the animal test.
So if we look at the example of the way that coronavirus is put into mice, I think this really illustrates everything that's wrong with using animal models. So this might shock you to hear it, but mice aren't actually naturally susceptible to coronavirus. They have to be genetically engineered to express the coronavirus receptor. So this means essentially harvesting eggs from a female mouse, injecting them with a human gene, putting them back into the female mouse, and allowing that mouse to give birth. And then the baby mice are screened. Some of them will be genetically engineered and they'll go on to infection studies. Some of them, it won't have worked, so those mice will just immediately be killed. And of those that go to the infection studies, these mice have to be anesthetized to have the virus squirted up their noses, and then they're experimented on for maybe a week or two. So this could involve being injected with a drug or, maybe force-fed through a stomach tube before being gassed to death and having their organs and tissues examined. Now, to me, that doesn't sound much like the way a human might catch and get sick with COVID-19. And it's not surprising to me either that these mice don't even develop the same symptoms as humans. So there's this coronavirus guy at the University of Iowa. He's really prominent and well respected in the coronavirus community. And he was quoted as saying that doing this doesn't really tell you much about how the virus causes disease.
And yet, these are the kind of tests that occur.
Absolutely. Yeah, these are the tests that occur. There was this article about how researchers are scrambling to get hold of these genetically engineered mice in order to do experiments on them. And then we have some animal models who, they don't have to be genetically engineered to be infected, but they still don't really exhibit the same symptoms as humans. They're really, really poor models for human infection.
So, really, in effect, testing on animals, if we're racing to try to find a vaccine that works, testing on animals is just a waste of time.
We have limited resources. We really don't have much time. We need to find something. We need to find it fast. So pouring money and time and research efforts into these sorts of things just seems completely ludicrous to me.
Well, Dr. Saunders, I really appreciate your time today and getting the message out to people, because I think most people, they don't know much about coronavirus. They don't know much about research and what goes on and the money that's spent. And I thank you for taking your time to enlighten us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dr. Samantha Saunders, PETA medical researcher and PETA's coronavirus expert, based in London. For more information about ending animal experimentation, go to PETA.org. And that's our program. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok or on ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. That's the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. I write for them also on my blog at amok.com. Thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on Apple Podcasts, where you can rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music provided by CarbonWorks. Check it out on YouTube. Join us again next time for more insight into animal rights and the fight for a cruelty-free world on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.